Hello and welcome back to this week's installment of the Weekly Album Spotlight, where today I will be finally trying to tackle one of my favorite avant-garde bands of the last 50 years, The Residents. The Residents are probably the most famous masked band that I can think of. Nobody knows who they are, even though technically everybody who's into The Residents has a pretty good idea who they are, and that's been the case for several decades now. Either way, the album I'm going to talk about today, God in Three Persons, came out in 1988, about a third of the way into their career, and kind of in the middle of a period of decline, because after their massive, epic, sweeping saga about oppressed workers and greedy elites, The Mole Show, came crashing down in the mid-80s, the band kind of lost their way for a little while and just spent the second half of the 80s making some really weird stuff. Like an album of cover songs from George Gershwin and Hank Williams, which deserves to be heard if only for how strange it is, but I'm not sure I would actually recommend it as something that you should listen to because it's good. But anyway, God in Three Persons breaks that trend, and it's, I would argue, probably the last amazing, stone cold classic Residents album. I mean, they have stuff after this that's really good. I really like Freak Show. I really like Wormwood. But this, to me, is the last phenomenal Residents album. Much like the Mole Trilogy, it is a concept album that tells a story in a really interesting way, but unlike the Mole Trilogy, I think it really lands and it works, and it's one of the most effective story albums or operatic kind of albums, even though this isn't really rock, so it's not a rock opera, so would it be like an avant opera? I don't know. It's probably one of the most effective albums of that sort that I've ever heard. Like, it probably blows anything The Who did out of the water. In the sense of having an actual narrative that is communicated well by the album. But I should probably talk about the narrative. So, God in Three Persons follows this sort of sleazy southern manager type who we're going to call Mr. X, because that's what the album calls him. Now, Mr. X finds these two Siamese twins, these androgynous Siamese twins who have this incredible power. They can heal the sick, raise the dead. There's something divine about them. And so he becomes their caretaker, and he kind of becomes this televangelist type. And this is probably the only album I'm ever going to give, that I'm going to review on this channel, that I'm ever going to give a content warning for, but this album needs it, because this album gets really dark, really fast. Basically, he becomes sexually attracted to one of these twins, who are also implied to be like teenagers at most, and starts to act on them. And as the album progresses, he gets more and more unhinged, and eventually you get the climax of the album in a track that is, I believe, called The Kiss of Flesh or something like that, and it gets incredibly just beyond messed up. Like, it goes to just about the darkest place you could imagine it going without murder. Like, that's where the story goes, and it's just so disturbing, but it's done so well, and it's executed in such a way that the album draws you along and keeps you entranced throughout the entire thing. Like, when I got to that track on the album, the first time I listened to it, I remember I think my jaw was just dropped, and I was like, oh my god, they went there. And that's kind of the whole album. And then somehow, spoilers by the way, massive spoilers, because I feel I feel like this is an album that deserves it. Somehow, the resolution, the ending of the track, is this really weird, it's this doo-wop track, musically, where you find out that what went down in Kiss of Flesh went down, and yet somehow the twins not only retained their miraculous healing properties, but they forgave Mr. X for what he did to them. And they continued independently of him to work their miracles and whatnot, but in a different way. And the album ends on a really interesting note. Like, it should not be a very powerful track, but that closing track on this album is an extremely powerful track somehow. And there's some really interesting ideas about good and evil and the way that they sort of need each other to exist. And it's fascinating. Like, this is an album where you could pick the story apart and just, for hours, you could write a thesis on this album. There's a lot of really interesting stuff happening, and there's a lot of very thematic stuff. I've always said to people that this is probably the most southern of the Residents albums, at least to me, in the sense that, like, I get the sense, like, this is where I feel the sort of the southernness, because they're one of the few things about the history of the Residents that we do know is that they were from Louisiana originally. They moved out to California in the 60s, and they've been there ever since. But they were from Louisiana originally. And I feel like this is the album where you, other than maybe Wormwood, where you feel that southernness and you understand that these people probably grew up, whoever the Residents may be, probably grew up steeped in that sort of fundamentalist Baptist kind of Christianity, because that sort of thing is all over this album, and that the faith healer kind of stuff, the televangelist kind of stuff. But there's also this vibe that I get from the album that is, and there's a lot, and Wormwood is arguably even more like this, where you could read parts of this album as a critique of Christianity and a critique of that kind of religion, and that's a very valid interpretation. I would kind of agree with it, actually. But you could also read the album as almost about something else. Like, I have a friend who's argued that Mr. X is, like, supposed to represent Satan. I'm not sure about that, but what I do get from the ending and what I get from the album as a whole is this vibe of, like, man cannot destroy what God has created, and that's a very interesting thing for the Residents to have done, especially if you know much about who the Residents probably are. That's a very interesting message to have made in an album. But musically, the album is very interesting because it probably has the most in common with, like, an early industrial and very primitive synth pop. Like, it's that murky, grimy 80s computer music sound all the way. Very simplistic backing tracks. Probably some of the most simplistic backing tracks the Residents ever worked with. And the music, the thing I love about the music is that there's this riff. They take this riff from this 60s one-hit wonder song called Double Shot of My Baby's Love, which that they must have, somebody in the Residents either really loved Double Shot of My Baby's Love or really hated it, because they already covered it on the Third Reich and Roll, which was their album of basically butchered covers of 60s classic pop songs. And they take that main organ riff from Double Shot of My Baby's Love, and they use it throughout this album as though it was this as though it was something Bach wrote 500 years ago. Like, that's how they use this. It's hilarious and it's amazing, and you will never listen to Double Shot of My Baby's Love the same way after you hear this album, because, you know, just the mental associations. But, you know, like I said, most of it is fairly sedentary, kind of electronic, late 80s music, but there are bits like Silver Sharp and Could Not Care, or Time, or the aforementioned Kiss of Flesh, where it just gets really, really nuts, and you get these almost dancey tracks, but everything is off and wrong, and it doesn't fit. And the one thing that I wish could have been different is that their off and on collaborator, Snakefinger, died the year before this came out very suddenly. And I've always heard that Snakefinger was supposed to lay down some guitar tracks on certain parts of this album, but they weren't able to do that because he died. And, like, I have to imagine this would have been a very different album if Snakefinger had been around to contribute. And I feel like it probably would have been better, because there's some really interesting, cool, sort of off-kilter and out-of-control guitar tracks on some of the later songs on the album, and I've got to imagine that, you know, if he had been around, that would have been even better, because he was a great guitarist. But, yeah. I don't really know what else to say about the album. It's a really, really fascinating listen. Even if you don't like it, it's a fascinating listen, and I was not expecting to like it as much as I did, because here's the thing about me, people. I actually am not the biggest fan of art that goes to that, like, dark, disturbing, just horrifying, messed up, just make you so depressed about the world place that this album goes to. I'm usually not into that kind of art, because I've always taken the stance of, you know, real life is, you know, miserable enough for a lot of people. Why does art also have to reinforce that? So, you know, when I say that a messed up, deliberately unpleasant piece of art is good, you know that there's got to be something there. You know, there's got to be at least something there. But, yeah, like I said, unless... This is definitely an album that I want to give a content warning for, and that you may not want to listen to if you're super sensitive to certain things. And look, I understand. I get it. I get it. I get it. Just putting that warning out there, because this album goes to some dark places, okay? Anyway, final point, probably something I should have said 10 minutes ago, but whatever. If there was one piece of music I wanted to see, I would love to see a David Lynch adaptation of this would be it, because this album screams like Twin Peaks or Inland Empire, or like really just the really, really dark parts of Twin Peaks is what this album screams to me. It's just all over the place, and it's a scary album, it's a sad album, it's a happy album, it's a lot of different things, but yeah, so that was God in Three Persons by The Residents, and yeah, I highly recommend it. Not necessarily for the faint of heart or the squeamish, but really good album. And yeah, I will see you guys later.